dream of once in a love.
I can understand people thinking that education is the equalizing force, but education has failed to be the great equalizer. You can't describe the kinds of things that the black community has experienced, slavery, Jim Crowism, second-class citizenship, and then say, okay now, let's all go to school together and ignore the impact of this history on our overall development. That history has had huge consequences. I've often thought about what it would have meant if in some way the black community and its allies back in 1954 or 64 had had the opportunity to sit and reflect for the moment, to radically accept where we were, where we had come to on the eve of achieving our civil rights. Most blacks were illiterate or were going to second-rate schools, and yet we were about to go forward in this country as, quote, equal partners, having been raised and organized as unequal partners. What if we had had town hall meetings 50 years ago where we could have reflected on what it meant to make this step, to ask ourselves, who are we? Where do we go from here? How do we go from here?
Begin our conversation today by introducing my three colleagues and saying something about our histories together. Gloria Strickland and I met in 1969 as students at Hofstra University. Gloria is from Long Island. I'm from Chester, Pennsylvania. Both of us grew up poor with all of the issues that accompanied being black and poor in the 1950s and 60s. We were also the first in our families to go to college. Over the years, Gloria and I pursued degrees in psychology and education. Our conversations, which started 40 years ago, were filled with passion and concerns about our nieces and nephews, and I must admit, about men. I like to share with people that Gloria and I, unplanned, literally left our husbands the same day. This is important. I often joke about it, but I actually think that it was an important part of our development. We couldn't grow with them. Gloria and I continued to search for ways to rescue black and Latino kids, discovering that we could not grow the young people unless we simultaneously worked to grow the world. And that meant becoming political women. Gloria is the director of the New Jersey's All Stars Project. Pam Lewis and I met when, in 1984, she showed up in New York City after meeting petitioners in Kansas who were working in one of our early efforts to get an independent on the ballot for president. On campus at the University of Kansas, Pam was an activist in the anti-apartheid movement, in the fight for women and for gay rights. Looking for a way to become politically involved, Pam joined the petitioners and came to New York City. As a political leader, she's helped to revolutionize learning for millions of young people both here and abroad. She and I have spent decades, along with Dr. Newman, Gloria, and others, fine-tuning in Vygotsky's terms the zone of proximal development, growth zones, for young people who our public school systems have pretty much abandoned. Pam is the national producer of the All Stars Talent Show Network and director of the Joseph A. Forgione Development School for Youth. Pam Lewis. Alveda Frazier saw me on TV in an advertisement for the Harlem Institute for Social Therapy, which was one of the several community-based therapy clinics that we created in New York in the 1980s. She called, we met, and began a dialogue about therapy, emotional pain, rejection, politics, Marxism, and motherhood that obviously continues until this day. Alveda, who's been politically active since she was 19 years old, has helped to politicize me and our development community, often raising very hard issues having to do with race and class conflicts. She is an attorney by training, a poet. She grew up in Savannah, Georgia, and we've marched together in more protest marches than I can ever remember. When I think of Alvader's unofficial title, I think of her as a champion for the world's underdogs. Alvader Frazier. I think it's fair to say that all four of us either went looking during the late 70s and early 80s for politics, or we went looking for solutions to very painful and wrenching problems, both personal and social problems, that required that we become political. There was a saying in the 1960s that the personal is political. What we've learned over the last 30 years by both creating and becoming a part of what we call a developing development community is that concepts and thinking about the personal and political needed to be overhauled to become postmodernized, meaning that they needed to move beyond traditional understandings and practices that, while advancing science and technology during the 19th and 20th centuries, when applied to human beings and the social sciences, served to stunt and distort the collective growth of our species. Hence the tremendous failure of psychology. A key person in this for all of us, relative to our decision and choice to work in the ways that we have over the past 30 years, is Dr. Fred Newman, a philosopher, playwright, psychotherapist, political activist, himself a postmodern Marxist, a Jew from the South Bronx. Fred recognized early on the relationship between developing America and developing Black progressive leadership, and that has been as much a hallmark of the work of the community as has been the discovery of development. I read Lois's introduction to the book, Performing Psychology, and also Fred Newman's chapter, A Therapeutic Deconstruction of the Illusion of Self. That's one of your reading pieces, which we'll talk about in a bit. I just wanted to share a few initial concepts relative to those readings as a way to kick off our discussion. Lois, Fred, and I were in Cuba in 1986 at an international conference on psychology when Fred presented the paper, Patient as Revolutionary. And in this piece, Fred basically took on the concept of consciousness raising as a misguided practice of the left movement in the United States, based on an assumption that one has to know how to do something before you can perform it. And as he points out in the book, never in the history of the world has anyone's consciousness been raised. He says that what it means for social therapists to relate to their patients as revolutionaries is to relate to ordinary human beings as capable of radically reorganizing our social structures and of creating and reorganizing the social environments which creates and develops pathology. So that's obviously not just for patients. Another key point that both Newman and Lois underscored, which I always found very, very helpful, is that human social phenomena, what we do, who we are, what we are capable of becoming as people, cannot be understood in the same way that we understand and study nature. We're not rocks or planets or stars yet. We happen to be people. Finally, after writing about 15 versions of what I was going to say to you all, I touched base with Dr. Newman. And I shared my dilemma about not overwhelming people with a lot of words, because we've become intimate with these concepts not by reading about them, but by virtue of our practice. He, as usual, hit the nail on the head, and he said that I and we should tell people that what we do is help people. and spend time deconstructing what